So when you go through these, you can click on these plinths, and it will tell you what that exhibit is, and it will give you a link to a Wikipedia article on the exhibit, and it'll in the open chat. So I'm standing in front of the Tsiolkovsky exhibit. So Antonin Tsiolkovsky, Alex, I can't remember his first name, one of those Russian names. So in between 1905 and 1915, he was basically doing all the math of what we call the rocket equations, or at least the first version of them. And he was coming up with some kind of notional ideas of how a liquid fuel rocket would work. So we've got with his portrait some of his early diagrams of his concepts. And so I built a 3D model of one of his ideas. So this would have been like a 4 deck liquid fueled, basically liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen fueled rocket, where you see the blue and the pink areas are basically side-by-side tanks of liquid oxygen and liquid hydrogen cooling the long, thin rocket nozzle. And so this was his original concept. It wasn't really feasible, but it was a good communication of the idea. And so this is a duplicate of Goddard's first rocket right here. And so it's sitting in its launch cradle. And so what is right next to it right here, that's spewing out little flames from the top, is the rocket itself. And so you notice that the flames are coming from this combustion chamber up at the top of Goddard's first rocket, and not from the bottom. And so this was because of an early misunderstanding of rocket stability. And so there's this principle that we now call the rocket pendulum fallacy. And the idea was that if you had your rocket engine at the top, that the mass of the rocket below the rocket, because the center of thrust would be up at the top, that having the center of mass below the center of thrust would create this pendulum effect that would stabilize the rocket so that the weight would keep it always pointing upward. Well, that turned out to not to be the case, because, as Einstein explained, that gravity and acceleration are essentially the same thing. So when you start accelerating your rocket with a rocket engine, the mass of the rocket below the rocket engine, it gets confused as to whether it's being acted on by the gravity of the planet or the acceleration of the rocket. And so if the rocket has any slight deficiencies in its design and alignment that will cause the thrust to go off center, then the entire rocket will go off center, and the mass below it will start this pendulum effect, and it will quickly dive over and crash. And so Goddard didn't quite get why the first rocket only flew 46 meters, and he built this second rocket, which has 2 sets of fuel tanks, and it's got this round hoop at the bottom, so it's called the hoop skirt rocket. And that also had its engine at the top, and it also suffered the same problem of the rocket pendulum fallacy and did not fly very far. And so he figured out that the rocket pendulum stabilization idea was a physics fallacy, and was able to prove it experimentally with these 2 rockets. And so from then on, he figured out other ways to stabilize the rockets, and namely he used gyroscopes. So he created the first gyroscopic stabilization system, and he built it into all of his later rockets. So this third rocket here is Goddard's L-13 rocket, and he had started off with the first few rockets on a grant from the Smithsonian Institution of $5,000 while he was a professor in Worcester. And then he met Charles Lindbergh, who was interested in his publications, and Lindbergh introduced him to the Guggenheim family. And so the Guggenheim family gave him a grant of $50,000 for him to use for his research. And because Goddard had uh, uh, tuberculosis, he had to move out west to a dry uh, environment to recover from his tuberculosis. And so he moved out to the deserts of New Mexico, near what is now White Sands, and he started basically a rocket ranch out there, and he started building all of his later rockets. So this L-13 rocket was the best performing of his models, and this embodies all of the inventions that he patented that basically made what is the modern liquid fueled rocket. So he had fin stabilization, thrust vectoring. You see those little things sticking out the bottom are intended to direct the thrust out of the nozzle of the rocket. And he has and basically those the thrust vectoring nozzles there get maneuvered by the gyroscope, the instrument that's inside. So the gyroscope gets tipped when the rocket goes off course, and the tipping of the gyroscope that wants to stay upright will basically hit some sensors, and the sensors will redirect the little paddles there to to maneuver the thrust coming out of the rocket engine to push what we call thrust vectoring. And so this is the first thrust vectoring vehicle of any time in history as well. And he came up with a altitude compensation system and parachute recovery. And he also created the first turbo pump for rocket engines as well. So he had all of these inventions built into these, and really, really brilliant insight in a lot of areas. He basically patented all the important things for making liquid fuel rockets work. And the U.S. really didn't recognize his accomplishments, but somebody did, and it was Germany. And they basically had people from the German embassy in D.C. copy all of his patents as soon as they were granted, and they delivered them to rocket researchers in Germany, namely Werner von Braun and Hermann Oberth. And so von Braun used his technologies to build eventually what became the V2 rocket that you've all heard about from World War II. So this rocket right here is the V2 rocket, and that's a couple pictures of Werner von Braun. One from when he was working on the V2, and then a later one when he was the head of the Redstone rocket facility and director of space operations for NASA. And so he came after the war to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip, along with a bunch of other German rocket scientists, and helped to build the American space program, which had started to develop its own rockets, but they weren't that big or that great at that point. A lot of what Goddard had accomplished had not been carried on with by other groups other than the guys who formed Jet Propulsion Laboratory. But here we've got in front of us a model of the V2 rocket engine sideways. And so we can see an important thing that Goddard had implemented in his engines, which had been invented by another fellow called by the name of de Laval. And so de Laval invented the de Laval nozzle to make earlier solid rockets more powerful. And the idea is that you need to constrict the flow in order to cause the thrust to speed up. Okay, in the vertical rocket there, based on from Ren's question, the black and white patterns are what the actual rockets would have had. So the one right next to us is a stock World War II V2 that was brought over in its German test paint scheme. Okay. And so the stand that it's sitting on is actually a German field test stand. So they would basically tow a V2 rocket on a trailer out to some place that was prepared, and they would set up this black stand, and then they would have a crane that would bring the V2 up and put it on the stand, and they would fuel it out there in the middle of nowhere from fuel carts, and they would launch it. And before the Allied spy planes spotted it and targeted it with artillery or with bombers. So, um, yeah. So, but the nozzle right in front of me that you see is that's steel and it's got some rings on it and so forth. I've got some colored phases inside the nozzle where it's cut away. So the idea is that this big bloomy part on the right side with the orange color, that's the combustion chamber. So the fuel gets injected by this injection head right here. Okay, you see all the little nozzles at the top of the injection head. And so that sprays the fuel. It tries to spray the fuel and the oxidizer in a very mixed way into the combustion chamber, so you get maximum mixing and thorough combustion. But the combustion is subsonic. The gases are moving below the speed of sound, and so you're not getting much thrust from that. But the way that things constrict here with this Venturi narrowing of the nozzle, that's the de Laval nozzle, and that causes the gases to accelerate through this constriction, and that's where they start going supersonic, and it keeps the supersonic shock wave trapped right there at the boundary between the orange and the yellow phases. And so then it goes from supersonic into the blue area, is where you have this next expansion phase. So even though it's expanding, it's not slowing down, it's accelerating as you expand it, because the expansion causes the pressure to drop, and that will accelerate it, so it goes into hypersonic speed. So the faster your exhaust gases are, you get more thrust, and you get more thrust for less fuel. And so the de Laval nozzle makes rocket engines really work. So that's what this little exhibit here is for, okay? So we brought a couple hundred V2 rockets back to the U.S. after the war. And in the interim, you guys have probably seen there was a TV show on a couple years ago about a rocket guy who was into the occult in Los Angeles back in the 30s and 40s, by the name of Jack Parsons. And so he was one of the founders of Jet Propulsion Laboratory, or JPL. And so his bunch from Caltech eventually developed this small liquid fuel rocket engine behind me, this kind of cylindrical on the outside, but in the inside it's got the same sort of design. And it fits into this small rocket right behind me that's called the WAC Corporal rocket. And it was an early American sounding rocket. It had one stage. So they were basically building on a lot of Goddard's work. And so in the 40s, they were launching these up to quite a 30 or 40 miles altitude, and with scientific instruments to measure the upper atmosphere. So then once the U.S. got all these surplus V2s here, they were testing the V2s themselves, but they also took some V2s and they created what's called the bumper rocket. And so they took a V2, which is right here, and it's got its new paint scheme on it. And at the very top of it, it's got a WAC Corporal rocket mounted in the nose. And so this was the very first two-stage liquid-fueled rocket in the world. And so this rocket reached an altitude of, I think it was 380 miles. And it basically verified a lot of the conditions in vacuum and radiation and things like that. So it was really an important accomplishment. This made the V2 the first rocket to actually reach outer space. So then we've got here, the radiation that was being measured was significant. And so scientists were wondering, how far does this radiation extend? Does it get lesser or greater as the higher you go? And so there's this one guy by the name of John Van Allen, who was a geophysicist, who had this theory that the Earth was protected by a magnetic field, and that's why we have your magnets can detect north and south. That's why your compasses work. That Earth has this magnetic field, and he deduced that Earth's electromagnetic field created these um, belts out in space that would entrap ionizing particles from the sun, the solar wind. And so he wanted to see if that was true and if he could measure it and how it was shaped and so on and so forth. And so first he was working with NOAA and the Coast Guard, launching the first of what we call raccoons, not raccoons, raccoons. So this little rocket in front of me is a solid fueled two-stage rocket called a Loki rocket. And this line it's hanging from, if you cam upward, you'll see it's hanging from a balloon up there. That's a big weather balloon. Not the big weather balloon, but like the smaller one that's up above us. And so this was called the Arobi Raccoon, and he was launching these from the backs of NOAA and Coast Guard ships from the equator up into the Arctic Circle. And so these, because the weather balloons would bring these rockets up to 100,000-foot altitude, and then the rockets would launch, and they'd have two stages. They would just go straight up. They wouldn't try to go to orbit. So he was trying to get maximum altitude, and his sensors kept detecting that the radiation was getting stronger the higher that he was going with these rockets. And so that started creating the first hint that his ideas about the electromagnetic field were possibly true. But he hadn't really hit the electromagnetic, the what we call the radiation belts yet. And so right around the time that the Russians launched, just before they launched their Sputnik rocket, the U.S. was starting to get serious about getting into space. And so they wanted to have something that would really knock people's socks off. So they built this second raccoon called the Operation Farside with a really big weather balloon you see above us. And this rocket that's in the middle of this frame is a four-stage solid fuel rocket. So the green part at the bottom is the first stage, and it's basically got four solid rocket motors clustered together with fins. And then above that is a second stage, which is the same sort of rocket motor, only a single one of them. And then the third stage is a cluster of five motors. Actually, there's four with another one in the middle. So the outer four motors are the third stage, and then the single motor in the middle of that cluster of five is the fourth stage. And so that fourth stage shoots that nose cone up there that's got some instruments in it, and that shot this rocket up to, according to the velocity that was measured, it would have reached a peak of 3,600 miles altitude. But the problem with this was that the radiation it was going so fast and so high, and the radiation and the magnetic fields were so dense that basically it generated its own lightning in space, and it shorted out its own radio, and we weren't able to collect any data from it. Oh, the idea with that is if you go into your preferences and you go to settings, I can't remember which setting it is, but you can actually set your voice so that it only listens to voice near your avatar, not where your cam is. Okay, so, but that shorting out of the rocket really helped. Van Allen was sure that it shorted out because it had hit the radiation belt. So then, later that month, the Russians launched their first intercontinental ballistic missile as a rocket to put the Sputnik 1 satellite into orbit. So that's what this rocket here is. And we see the little Sputnik satellite right in front of us. Okay? And it really didn't do anything other than send out some radio beeps to signal where it is and so forth. I think it might have had a radiation sensor on it as well, but not much else. Okay, so the next rocket that was put into space was the American Explorer 1. The U.S. had been trying to launch their Vanguard rockets for quite a long time, and the Vanguard program was run by NASA, and the Vanguard rockets kept failing either on the launch pad or shortly after launch, and none of them got into orbit soon enough. And so the president asked the Army to step in with their Redstone ballistic missiles. So the Redstone rocket is really just sort of a let's call it a roided up V2. All right, so it's longer than a V2, but the same dimension, same diameter, and the engine is pretty similar. And so it's basically a super-sized V2. It's got the same sort of thrust vectoring, so on and so forth. But what they did is they attached this upper stage to it over here, which is like they did with Operation Farside. They clustered a bunch of solid rocket motors to be a booster stage. And so we see on the outer ring, there's, let's see, 1, 5, 6, 11. There's 11 solid rocket motors in the outer ring, which is this cylinder. And then on the inside, there's actually a third stage of 3 motors. And those 3 motors boost what's up above here, which is the Explorer 1 satellite, which has its own final kick motor on it to put it into orbit. And so what they did with this is they were concerned about the stabilization of the upper stages because the gyroscope stabilization was only on the Redstone itself. So they came up with this idea of they basically put a centrifuge on the top of the rocket mounted to these upper stages. And so before it launched, this whole upper stage assembly with the satellite were spun up, so they are rotating. So if you ever look at a video of the Explorer 1 rocket taking off, you'll see the upper stage looks like it's actually rotating, and that's because it actually is. And so once it detached from the Redstone, it kept spinning like a spinning football. You know how quarterbacks, when they throw a long pass, the football rotates, and that's what stabilizes it. If they didn't make a football spin, it wouldn't be stable and it wouldn't go nearly as far enough. Well, in this case, you need it to go in the same direction, so the thrust keeps going the same way. So you need spin stabilization for that reason. So with those stages, it was able to put Explorer 1 in orbit. And the notable thing about Explorer 1, other than being the first American satellite, is that it actually was able to fly up into the Van Allen radiation belt. And it confirmed that the radiation belt was there, and it measured its strength and different altitudes and so forth. And it confirmed Van Allen's theory, so that's why it's now called the Van Allen radiation belt and not something else. And so then after that, the Sputnik 2 and 3 satellites were launched on the same type of R7 booster. And then NASA finally got their Vanguard rocket to work. And this is the Vanguard here, and it's got this tiny little Vanguard satellite. And so that was America's second satellite into orbit. And it had the first solar cells on it. So this is the first satellite with solar cells. So if you look at this little spinning cutie right in front of us here, it's got these little square modules on the sides, and those are solar cells. And it didn't have any stabilization, so it was tumbling in orbit like it's doing now. And that's why it needed to have solar cells on all faces so that it could generate power no matter, which face was facing the sun. So then more satellites got done, and then we finally got to starting manned flight. So this is the Vostok module, which is the first man in space with Yuri Gagarin. And The module fit on a improved R7 rocket that has an upper stage on it. And so we can go on from there to seeing all the other rockets. We've got the Mercuries, we've got Gemini, we've got the Apollo program, we've got the Soyuz from the Russians, and so on and so forth up into the present day. So we've got a lot of resources here. Right now, you probably see that to the south of us, there's a bunch of rockets hanging off in space. And that's because the rocket ring we're on right now is our new rocket ring, which is much larger than the old one, which is the old ring was under where those other rockets are. And so we're in the process of replicating and moving those rockets because the person who made those other rockets isn't involved with us anymore and refused to give us permissions. So we've got to replace all of his work, which is annoying. Now, one other important exhibit we've got right here is, particularly given all the ladies involved here, is something that Rosa did back here, is our exhibit on women in space. So this opened up on Women's Day. Was it Mother's Day or Women's Day? Rosa can detail. So we've got a list here of all of the women that have been to space and what missions they were on, when they flew, any notable accomplishments. So women have really come a long way since the very first women in space. And now they're a regular and very involved part of the space program. And we've even got non-NASA civilian women flying into space. For instance, Wally Funk, who's the oldest woman to fly in space. We have Stan Proctor, Haley Arsenault, and Yulia Peresi. And I think one more over here. Oh, Kayla Bannerin is a NASA astronaut. So, there's a great involvement of women in the space program. Not just, we've all, if you've seen the, there was a movie about a African American woman, Ms. Johnson, who was an essential part. It was an essential part of the Apollo program because of her fantastic mathematical capabilities, and her whole department was largely women. It was because back in the day, computers were not pieces of equipment sitting on your desk; they were people, and usually they were women with mathematical capabilities. But they got, they were at that point. Unfortunately, many men still treated them as appliances, which is an embarrassment to, of course, men of today. But it was a fact, and it's great to see that women have become a equal part of the space program and of other accomplishments. All right, so that's what we're going to show for the rocket exhibits. Now we're going to head over to the Mars base, and we'll go around and we'll show you what's going on over there. So, okay, does everybody have a landmark? Rosa, did you give those out? Okay, let me make sure I've given you the right one. Oh, looks like we got everybody. Okay, cool. All right. Now, is everybody seeing the sky kind of orangey, or are you seeing a blue sky? Okay. Please go to your world menu to environment and select use shared environment. Okay, cool. So we're using EEP here to provide us a realistic Mars environment. Okay, so we have two styles of spacesuits for those of you biological creatures. I don't have a tiny spacesuit, so I'm not sure if either of these will fit on Ren. I apologize for that. That's something we're actually working on, making a tiny spacesuit. So you're all welcome to get suited up, since we're on Mars and there is no real atmosphere. The Martian atmosphere is only 6 millibars of almost pure carbon dioxide with some argon. So Rosa, did Noma give you that outfit that she had? Okay. So here we are at the landing point, and so we have here parked on the two landing pads some SpaceX Starship rockets, and we're just about ready to deploy one of those as a scripted vehicle that will actually transport people from the museum region, or the museum part of the region, over here to Mars, so you'll be able to actually ride the Starship up into space and experience zero gravity, and then we'll come down and land, and you'll depart from the rocket and come down here. And so for people that arrive on Mars, their first arrival, we haven't finished the elevator yet because it's scripted, but this little mound over here is actually the entry to our first HAB module facility. And so you would have airlock doors, and you come in and you would unsuit and then go through these doors into the elevator and go down, and we've got a number of modules underground that you would spend the first 2 weeks in basically in quarantine in case of any possibility of any Earth diseases. Let's say you brought COVID with you and maybe developed a asteroid variant or something. And so we want to make sure that everybody on Mars is protected from that. So you would be in isolation for a few weeks until everything was sterilized. And so then you would proceed from there over to the main part of the base. Now, one of the key things, I talked earlier about how specific impulse is important for rockets, in that it gives you the efficiency to get where you need to go with as little fuel as possible. Now, one of the problems that we had with the Apollo missions to the moon is that when the astronauts landed on the moon, they had to bring with them to the moon all the fuel they needed to get off of the moon, and they had to bring with them also the fuel that they needed to get out of lunar orbit to get back to Earth. And so because of that need to bring your fuel with you, that increased the mass of their vehicles a lot, and because of the increase in the mass of their vehicles, it also increased the mass of the Saturn V rocket a lot, and that's why the rocket had to be so big and powerful. If you can get to Mars in a rocket and land with nearly empty tanks, and you have a way of refueling on Mars with fuel that's made on Mars, then you don't need nearly as big of a rocket as you needed to get to the moon, or whatever you use for a rocket can carry a whole lot more payload because you don't have to carry all that mass and fuel. And so we have to use this is the first step of what we call in situ resource utilization, or ISRU. And so the idea is to use resources on Mars to make all the stuff that we need on Mars, either to live on Mars or to send people or things back to Earth. And so the first thing is we need to make fuel on Mars if we want to send these rockets back to Earth to get more people and things. And so this is why the Starship rocket is the first rocket in human history to use methane with its liquid oxygen oxidizer, because methane is a fuel that we can easily make on Mars. Okay, there's no oil on Mars, so there's no natural gas, which is what methane is. But there's no gasoline either, and the only way to get hydrogen is by cracking up water, but then you still have cryogenic storage issues. Methane is also cryogenic, but not nearly as cold. And hydrogen rockets require very huge tanks because the density of hydrogen is so low. That's why the shuttle had that huge external fuel tank, is because it had to carry so much liquid hydrogen that is low density. So, for instance, kerosene has a density of about 1 gram per cubic centimeter. Okay. Water has a density of 1 gram per cubic centimeter. Liquid oxygen has a density of 1.4 grams per cubic centimeter. I'm sure some of you may have Googled this at some time, but the density of liquid hydrogen is 0.07 grams per cubic centimeter because it's the lightest and least dense element out there. And so because it's so low density, you have to have humongous tanks of it in order to have useful amounts. And a huge tank is a heavy tank. And a huge tank also means a lot of material and a lot of thermal protection and so on and so forth. So the idea is this is something that was developed as a concept by Robert Zubrin, Dr. Robert Zubrin, originally Martin Marietta. He's the founder of the Mars Society, and he dug up a 19th century chemical engineering process called the Sabatier process to produce methane. And so let's go over to the Sabatier cracking facility over here, and I'll show you how this works. Follow me. Okay, so Sabatier was a French chemical engineer in the 19th century who came up with this process, which was promptly forgotten because it was considered unnecessary once we had oil and gasoline and all this great fossil fuel that we're now burning up and dumping stuff into the atmosphere about. So back at that point, the primary fuel that people were using was whale oil, and whales were running out. So Sabatier came up with this idea of producing methane with this process to create gas for lamps and so forth. So the plinth in front of you will give you a note card that explains the process, but I'll do that in voice here. So the idea is we start off with water, or H2O. And so there's lots of water on Mars in ice form. A lot of it's underground. There's some on the surface. But there's a whole lot more water on there than we used to think. And so we're going to dig up some ice, some Martian ice, and we're going to put it in this purple H2O tank that's right in front of us here. And so then the water is going to go into the metal box that's in front of it that's got some power cables going to it, and it's going to get electrolyzed. And so electrolysis splits H2O into H2 and O2, which is liquid hydrogen and liquid oxygen. So the O2 gets cooled down and gets sent over to the blue LOX tank over on the right end of this exhibit. And so it's not LOX for your bagel. The LOX stands for liquid oxygen, and chemically that is O2. And so the H2 or LH2, as it's liquefied, goes into the green tank. And so we've got liquid hydrogen in the green tank, and then over on the far left end of this exhibit, you see there's a yellow tank with CO2 on it. And so on top of the CO2 tank is essentially a turbo pump, or turbo compressor actually, and it basically compresses CO2 out of the Martian atmosphere and into the yellow tank. So then the LH2 tank and the CO2 tank send their respective gases into that vessel in between those two tanks. And that vessel is a high pressure vessel, and it's got a large induction coil wrapped around it. So power is run through that induction coil to heat up the contents of that tank, and inside the tank is also a bed of platinum pellets that act as a catalyzer. So between the heat and the electricity and the catalyzing metal, the CO2 and the liquid hydrogen get converted into methane gas and water gas, steam, and they go up through the top and into the pipe up top there that's got condensing fins on it that cools it down. And so the first condenser cools down the steam back into H2O, so the H2O goes back into the purple H2O tank, so it can go back through the process. And then the methane gas doesn't get condensed in the first condenser, the water does. So the water goes into the purple tank and goes back through the system. The methane gas goes into the second condenser and winds up as liquid methane, CH4, in the orange tank. And so you've got your liquid methane and liquid oxygen, and that's our fuel combination for the Starship rocket. And so this is why the Raptor rocket engine, which is the most efficient rocket engine ever developed, it's what's called a full flow stage combustion cycle engine, which is a very complex name for something that basically it burns all the fuel and oxidizer in the most efficient ratio possible. Okay.